At this point, we're going to shift gears a little bit and hand over to our other team of researchers. So this is a slightly different shift, but actually talking about the political economy of aid, where, and I'll try to describe this and I'll let the others explain it, really looking at conflict zones and localization and expansion of competition for resources. And I'm really excited to hear from these two researchers that are looking at some of these really high risk categories of people and vulnerability and how we perceive these things. Dustin Barter is a John Monash scholar undertaking his PhD now in development studies at the University of Cambridge. He's currently based in Cambodia, and he is studying the dynamics between international institutions and civil society in Cambodia and Myanmar. I'll let you poke around on the website and learn a little bit more about Dustin. And then his partner in this presentation is Gun Mai, who is currently working as Associate Program Officer on constitutional issues with International IDEA in Myanmar. He was previously working with the Nien Foundation, which I think I pronounced that correctly. It means shalom, which I think is the international word for peace also. And he's looking specifically at, he has a previous humanitarian response and looking at peace building in Myanmar's Kachin state. So I believe that these two researchers, because of a worry about internet stability in Myanmar and Cambodia, they've pre-recorded their session. But then they'll be back with us in just a moment for the Q&A.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for tuning in. Today, we are presenting the Conflict Dividend, Access and Disempowerment, with a focus on Myanmar, Somalia, and Somaliland.
Hi, my name is Gun Mai, and I formerly work on humanitarian response in Kachin State, which is northern part of Myanmar. I'm currently working with International IDEA in Myanmar.
My name is Dustin Barber, and I previously worked in humanitarian response in all 3 locations, and I'm currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Cambridge. Before we start, we'd like to thank Deacon and all the other organizers and supporters for making the conference happen. And also I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Gun Mai, who is currently dealing with a lot of challenging circumstances in Myanmar, yet still managed to prepare for this presentation. We may focus on these 3 locations, but we present this in solidarity with local humanitarian actors across the world, supporting millions, if not billions of people facing immense hardship right now. So before looking specifically at the conflict dividend, we want to embed the presentation in this broader context of the professionalization of humanitarian actors and humanitarian space, which in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but what it has also cultivated is this sense of operating as a business. Whether it's a UN agency, INGO, or domestic actor, there is this underlying ideology of operating like a business where growth is seen as essential and bigger is nearly always seen as better. A quick glance of any resource mobilization or country director position highlights how dominant the idea is, while many other jobs, such as program managers or technical positions, also have this incentive for expansion. Managing or advising on a 10 million as opposed to $1 million program always sounds more impressive. Similarly, after a few years stint as a resource mobilization person or country director, you really want to be able to show that you have expanded your programming over that time and money coming in. Unfortunately, it's very, very rare to see percentage of localization, satisfaction of partners, or quality of partnerships as key selection criteria or performance indicators. This deeply embedded drive for expansion therefore cultivates competition, and the side product of that is that it marginalizes localization efforts. When push comes to shove, securing funding for your organization is nearly always prioritized over supporting localization. That is, unless localization is seen as a means for expansion of your own organization's work, where we have seen many international actors jumping on the localization bandwagon, or at least presenting themselves in such a way as a means to expand their own programming. For example, if OCHA has a minimal localization content to access funding, then all of a sudden international actors jump onto localization because they need to do that to access funding. As we will show in part of this presentation, This portrayal of international actors being committed to localization is often clearly contradicted by the organization's actions in other locations.
Armed conflict is one of the main causes of humanitarian crisis around the world, and often the conflict and related restriction limits access to the worst affected area where the most humanitarian assistance is needed. This can be due to several reasons, including security or safety issue for the humanitarian actors. In such situation, rather than international humanitarian actor, domestic or local humanitarian actors usually have better access to the area in need because they are embedded in the local context. Often international actors depend on domestic actor to be able to deliver humanitarian assistance because the domestic actor understand the local context and have more flexibility to operate according to the context, such as being able to cross the conflict lines or enter area controlled by a certain clan or ethnic group. This enables local actors to deliver humanitarian access even during intense conflict situations. As the impact, the conflict dividends occur when domestic actors leverage or influence their relative access monopoly to push for humanitarian system change. But is it important to aware that there are structural inequality which can be reinforced in a humanitarian context, where domestic actors operate with the highest rate, while international humanitarian actors have lower risks?
Our first case study to illustrate some of the dynamics and tensions around the conflict dividend is to look at Somalia and Somaliland that really offer striking contrasts and kind of question some of the international supposed commitments to localization. The focus on these two areas is not to delve into some of the political dynamics and tensions between them. So let's focus first on Somalia, where it is heavily conflict affected and insecure following the collapse of the government in the early 90s and ongoing civil war and armed conflict. Many areas of Somalia are inaccessible to international actors, and therefore they rely on and outsource a lot of the work in the most conflict affected and challenging areas to Somali humanitarian actors, where they are largely relegated to operating in these really challenging areas. It's a common occurrence across the world. In many ways, these Somali actors have been able to leverage the conflict dividend in this way by saying, we have access to these areas. We also want to push for greater localization. And you see many Somali humanitarian actors as great advocates for localization at the national level, at the global level. They've been heavily involved in starting up and continuing the operations of the NEAR network. The OCHA-run Somalia Humanitarian Fund is also heavily localized. And you also see Somali NGOs on the humanitarian country team. However, relegated to operating in the most insecure environments within Somalia poses lots of risks that do result in more operational problems for Somali humanitarian actors. They must navigate major security challenges, the presence of non-state armed actors, and many other dimensions of volatility. Meanwhile, international actors that operate in Somalia tend to operate in the more stable areas, which are far easier to operate and have far less operational challenges. What results is this perpetual view of Somali humanitarian actors as less reliable than international actors, whether this is delays in implementation or various compliance issues. What this view overlooks is how the Somali domestic actors are operating in the most challenging context and without the extensive support networks and structures that international actors. For example, if an international actor even has a compliance issue, they can simply just reimburse the compliance issue out of unrestricted funding. This is a luxury unavailable to Somali organizations that rarely even get any support costs. Also need to think about all the security structures and support systems that international actors have that is unavailable to many Somali organizations. So you have, in summary, in Somalia, a lot of the Somali organizations working in the most challenging areas, which is really difficult. They have been able to leverage the conflict dividend, but they also face this continued disempowerment because they are operating in the most difficult contexts. Meanwhile, international actors, they are operating in the more stable parts of Somalia, but they hold up the support they provide to Somali organizations as proof of their commitment to localization. Now, if we look to Somaliland, this really questions these supposed commitments to localization from international actors. Somaliland, in contrast, is much more stable and less conflict affected. International actors can access nearly all parts of Somaliland, and these same actors that say they're committed to localization in Somalia, therefore go ahead and do direct implementation and often marginalize and compete with domestic humanitarian responders in Somaliland. This then really questions, is this a genuine commitment to localization where you are, as an international actor, basically using Somali actors for localization in Somalia out of necessity, not out of choice. But then it comes to Somaliland and you're quite happy to go ahead and do direct implementation and marginalize the whole localization agenda.
To understand about case study, let me tell briefly about the context. Kachin State is located in the northern part of Myanmar, which is also known as Burma. In Kachin State, because of the armed conflict between one of the ethnic armed groups called Kachin Independent Organization or KIO and Myanmar military in 2011, there are more than 100,000 IDP in more than 100 IDP camps. The IDP camps are mainly located in two control areas, which are under government control area, where mostly in cities, and under non-government or KIO control areas, where very remote or hard to reach area. Even though individual organizations respond separately in the beginning of the conflict, Joint Strategy Team or JST was formed in 2015 with 9 domestic local organizations to provide humanitarian assistance to be more effective and efficiency. Key point that I would like to highlight here is the JST is the main actor who provide humanitarian assistance to the IDP, those who are living in non-government control area. The domestic organization need to use several alternative ways to be able to provide assistance. For example, a lot of humanitarian assistance were delivered through China because IDP camps are located on the border with China. There were a couple of UN and INGO convoy in the beginning of the conflict, but it stopped soon later because of the government's restrictions. Even though the UN convoy that went in the beginning of the conflict can reach only some IDP camps in non-government control areas. Therefore, the domestic organizations are the main actor who can provide the assistance because the UN and INGO could not reach to the area with the most need. The local humanitarian actors are the primary sources of information and data to share among other actors, such as UN and INGOs. Such situations supported GST to advocate to increase localization approach in the humanitarian response and to change humanitarian system. For example, GST advocate UN and INGO donors to provide humanitarian funding directly to the local humanitarian actors for more effectiveness and more efficiency. There are 2 main points that I would like to highlight here. 1, the work of GST is not only humanitarian response, but also advocacy efforts among related stakeholders. Engaging with stakeholders are not only humanitarian actors such as UN agency and INGO, but also peace process actors who are the key actor to end armed conflict, which is the root causes of humanitarian crisis. Second, because of joint effort of GST, there are significant progress in localization in humanitarian response in kitchen context, which means local humanitarian organizations are still key actors to provide humanitarian aid, and international organizations, including UN agencies and INGO, are taking more on the supporting role. Essentially, GST was able to leverage the conflict dividends, their access to non-government control area, to advocate for humanitarian system change. As evidenced in Kachin, Myanmar, conflict dividends is something that can be leveraged effectively by domestic actors, where the focus should be on pushing for broader humanitarian system change.
Another key conclusion to be drawn from the presentation is from the contrast between Somalia and Somaliland that really questions international commitments to localization. We believe there are many other examples across the world, and the slow pace of change since the Grand Bargain 5 years ago also questions international commitments to localization. We recognize it's not simply about funding, but it really is about broader humanitarian system change that remains simply inadequate.
Although we only draw in on Somali and Myanmar examples, we believe the conflict dividend is also present in other conflict-affected contexts. The conflict dividend can advance localization efforts, but with major caveats. Most notably, how it can also force domestic actors to operate in the highest risk environments and internationally in the lower risk locations, perpetuating stereotypes around trust and reliabilities.
Our final conclusion to be drawn from the conflict dividend is also the need to look beyond headline statistics that the humanitarian system seems to love so much. Although there may be examples of increased humanitarian funding going towards domestic and local actors, it is also about questioning the quality of this localization. If this is simply a result of international actors providing money to local humanitarian actors because of access issues or volatility or armed conflict, this is very low quality localization. What we really need to see is the high quality localization, not just in areas that are inaccessible, but also in areas where international actors could be operating, but choose to work with local partners. Otherwise, we're just going to see this perpetual structural inequalities where you have international actors operating in the easier, accessible areas and local actors relegated to the most challenging areas. And this creates perpetual problems that really need to be addressed for broader humanitarian system change. Thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to the discussion.
Wow, I am really, really impressed by this research. I think Dustin and Gun Mai, you guys have really done some case studies here that show different angles of how localization really looks in practice and what the drivers are, which I think is really, really interesting. I'll refrain from adding too much of my own reflections and experiences from working in conflict zones, but needless to say, I was really, really happy to see that there's a body of research out there developing to not just talk about localization, but to look at how it happens, why it happens. And I love this concept of the conflict dividend.